Be the envy of the neighborhood. 860 KKAT, where the grass is always greener. Welcome to Gardening Utah. Here's composter and show hoster, Jana Francis.
Welcome to Gardening Utah. I'm your host, Jana Francis. Every week here on Gardening Utah, we give you gardening inspiration and advice from experts across the state. We talk about all things vegetables, flowers, trees, shrubs, and of course, your lawn. Thank you for listening. We really hope that the show is something you look forward to checking in with every week. Episodes drop every weekend on Apple Podcasts to get you ready for working in the yard on the weekend. So make sure you subscribe. All you need to do is open the podcast app on your Apple iPhone and look for Gardening Utah, and you can just hit that subscribe button, and every time we drop a new episode, you'll be able to have a listen. Now, if you don't have an Apple iPhone, you can still listen to our episodes. You can listen on 860 KKAT AM on Saturday and Sunday in Utah, which you may be listening to right now. And you can also listen to past episodes on 860kkat.com/garden. So my hope is this is a fun and informative show that you can listen to while you're out and about, kind of getting to work in the garden, or maybe you're shopping in the nurseries or garden centers, so you can be inspired and stay in the know on all the tasks you need to accomplish. But first, it's the tip of the week.
860 KKAT with your Gardening Utah tip of the week.
My tip of the week is the importance of weed identification. Now, I'm not talking about the weed that was just legalized in many states around the nation with this election. What I am talking about is the weeds outside in our yard. Now listen, a good tip is keep your friends close, but your enemies closer, right? Well, in this case, know your enemy, which is the weeds outside in your yard, because just like flowers, there are annual weeds and there are perennial needs, and they take very different management programs in order to properly get rid of them and get them out of your yard. And if you don't know what you're going after or what you're dealing with, you could be doing the absolute wrong thing at the wrong time of year, and you might be behind from the very beginning. So different weeds take very different actions. Now, in general, annual weeds, just like flowers that are annuals, grow from seeds from the previous growing season. And while perennial weeds grow from established roots that survive winters as well as they reseed also. So from the standpoint of chemical control, the grouping and understanding the difference of these two is so important, because pre-emergent herbicides that you may put down in the spring, they're only effective for the control of annual weeds, and they don't even touch your perennial weeds. Perennial weeds require a totally different management program, and in fact, they're the most difficult to get rid of, and especially because they spread both by seed and creeping roots or rhizomes. And if you don't pull out the entire root, which most often you can't and don't, the plant will actually reproduce from every single little root left behind in the soil. And you will have similar problems with perennial weeds that grow very, very deep and have very hard to remove taproots, kind of like field bindweed or wild morning glory, which we've talked about many times throughout this last season on Gardening Utah. One of my tips of the week was dedicated solely to the prevention and management of field bindweed, and it takes a long time, and you have to treat it the right way in order to get rid of it. Other perennial weeds are things like Bermuda grass, or some perennial or more like biennial weeds or thistles like Scotch thistle or yellow star thistle, which, by the way, if you ever see those, keep them away from your horses. Or white top or quack grass. Now listen, not all weeds respond equally well to all treatment measures, so it really makes sense to understand, if you've got a bigger problem with these, what exact weed it is, and really use Google as your friend to understand exactly what to do. Now, the USU Extension Service has so many great tips and tricks on their website on exactly what to do about very different weeds. So I highly suggest using Google as your friend to look this up and understand exactly what to do with perennial weeds. Now, some of the annual weeds, which for me, I just mostly pick straight up out of the ground, especially after a good rainstorm. Some of the thistles, puncture vine, aka goat heads, which are the most miserable thing to step on without shoes on in the planet. Crabgrass, purslane, spurge, prickly lettuce, and red root pigweed. A lot of those, that when they'll crop up in my yard, I will just pull them straight away out, especially after a good rain. Now, a couple of the great ways to manage your weeds. The number one tip that you will always hear if you haven't already is mulch. Mulch, mulch. Now, mulch does an amazing job of keeping the soil cool and moist by depriving weeds of light, which is exactly what they need to germinate. Now, every square inch of your garden contains weed seeds, if you think about it, every square inch. But only those in the top inch or two of the soil that get enough light actually trigger germination. And that is why mulch is so important. And just so you know, when you're digging around in your yard and you're maybe turning the soil and you're cultivating, it brings a lot of those hidden weed seeds right up to the surface. So assume that they are there and they're ready to erupt, kind of like ants on a really mad anthill. Every single time you open a patch of ground. So really, a great method of weed control is really only dig when you need to, and immediately cover that disturbed spot with mulch. Now, this may be an old wives' tale, but when I grew up, my grandpa would always tell me, the way you get rid of weeds is you pull when they're wet and you hoe them when they're dry. And just like I said, when you just get a good rainstorm, go out there and weed when the weeding's good, especially when it relates to the annual weeds. Grab some garden gloves and get out there. But under dry conditions, weeds sliced off just below the soil line, they promptly shrivel up and die in most cases, especially if what you're using has a sharp edge, like maybe a hoe or maybe a pair of garden shears. Now, no matter what I'm encouraging you to do right now, maybe right after this episode is over though, just go out there and lop off their heads. Act like you're the queen in Alice in Wonderland and lop off their heads. When you can't remove the weeds, the next best thing is to just literally chop off their heads, because especially with annual weeds, deadheading gives you more time before those seed heads just spread and get down into that soil, because once they're in the soil, forget about it. You're not going to be getting those up. So I really, in worst case scenario, every time I see a seed head, I try to somehow contain it, grab it, get it in a bag or, into the garbage as soon as possible, so that we can really reduce the reseeding of that plant. And quite often, if you just lop off their heads, it can force that weed to use up its food reserves and exhaust its supply of root buds, and that will limit the spread. But again, that depends on the weed, which is another reason why this tip of the week is important, because you are identifying what the weeds don't want so that you can properly control them. And that was the tip of the week.
Never miss a tip for your garden. Never miss a tip for your garden. And never miss an episode. The Gardening Utah Podcast with Jana Francis on 860 KKAT.
Okay, that wasn't just a tip of the week, you guys. That was a full-on motivational seminar about getting out in your yard and pulling your weeds. And if we all band together, we'll have much prettier yards collectively, won't we? All right, so when we come back after this, we are going to talk about getting your garden beds all winterized and ready for the winter so they come back next year with the best possible soil for your garden. Stay with us.
She's more than just gardening puns and sage advice. It's Gardening Utah with Jana Francis on 860 KKAT. Gardening Utah, available wherever you get your podcasts and at 860kkat.com/garden. Here's Jana Francis.
Welcome back to Gardening Utah. I'm your host, Jana Francis, and in this segment, we are going to talk about how to put that garden to bed for the winter, especially your raised beds as well. So whether you had a vegetable garden just on the ground or a raised bed or both, we're going to talk about everything you need to do to make sure that you're all set for next year and you do everything now that will prevent diseases and really improve that soil over the next couple months, so that in the spring it is amazing. But usually at about now on the show, I like to talk about events going on around Utah that are related to gardening. And usually there's a lot. But of course, right now there is a lot of them canceled for 2020, which is such a bummer. And specifically, I wanted to mention that the 2020 Fall Orchid Show at Red Butte, which is one of my favorite things in the world, is canceled. So if you were planning on going to the Fall Orchid Show, it's not happening this year, and that would be technically if you're listening to this live on KKAT 860 AM in Utah. That would be normally today or tomorrow is when it was originally scheduled for. So don't head up to Red Butte. It's canceled, which is such a bummer. But I did want to bring up an event they have that's virtual that sounds pretty fun. So it is a succulent terrarium workshop, and it's going to be virtual. So you can do it from wherever you would like. And if you'd like more information on that, you can go to redbuttegarden.org. I believe it's $55 to the general public or $43 if you are a member. It's Thursday, November 12th at 6:30. You do need to register in advance, but they will walk you through exactly how to create a low-maintenance terrarium with succulents. So pretty cool. Succulents are so popular nowadays. And I wanted to have a succulent expert on my show, but I figured I would wait until it got into the colder months when we weren't necessarily, having to talk about so many different things related to outside. So there's actually somebody really cool over at Mill Creek Gardens. And Lorene Boutner, if you're listening to this episode, she's the owner of Mill Creek Gardens. If you're listening to this, Lorene, I apologize. I don't remember his name, but I would like to have him on the show sometime, maybe later this month or next, and to talk all about succulents, because I had taken a trip up to Mill Creek Gardens a couple months back and spoke with him, and I was just fascinated at how much knowledge he had on succulents, and could even just look at, any kind and tell you, oh, well, that's a such and such, and that's a such and such. And I was blown away. So succulents are so freaking popular right now. So I'll try to have him on the show in the coming months. But again, next Thursday, the 12th at Red Butte Garden, you can, or not at Red Butte Garden, excuse me, you can take their virtual online class. Just go to redbuttegarden.org to find out more information about that for Thursday, November 12th. So, okay, now listen, I want to talk about winterizing your garden bed. Now, really, what they say is clean up for the best spring green up. And I know that now that gardening season has come to an end, if you're like me, everything is frozen. And it's really easy to get distracted with everything inside when it's colder outside. Although, my goodness, hasn't it been beautiful lately? But it's now going to get cold and stay cold for good for the next couple months. But, once it does get cold, it's easy to think, oh, it doesn't matter. It's easy to just kind of forget about it. It's outside. You're not going out as much. You're not looking at it as much. But it is really important to clean up your garden beds for next spring. And really, when you think through it, there are three main goals as to why we want to really clean up our garden beds. And this goes for raised beds or just your regular vegetable garden. And quite honestly, in many cases, just your normal, flower beds. But the three main goals are this: to promote soil health, because the healthier soil that you have, the more healthy plants you will have, and it just makes everything better. And number two, to ward off weeds. Now, obviously, I harped on that with my motivational speech in the last segment, all about warding off weeds. But really, that is one of the main goals to cleaning up in the fall and getting your garden beds winterized. And then three, to prevent diseases for next year's crops. Because if you leave a lot of that, tomato plants out, or squash plants just laying there in the garden, they really can bring disease into the garden. Especially into next spring. So those are the three main goals of really doing a good fall cleanup. Now let's go through the main steps that you need to do in order to accomplish this. So step one, obviously, what we just said, removing the weeds. You're probably ready to be done with weeding, but again, as I mentioned in the first segment, this is one of the most important times of the year to be weeding. A lot of those weeds are setting seed right now, so off with their heads, like I mentioned. And listen, I forgot to mention this in the last segment, but some weed seeds can stay viable in the soil for 30 to 40 years. And I'm not kidding, or even longer. So it really makes sense. Every single time I go out and I cut off a seed head for weeds, or for a weed, or I pull weeds or whatever, I think about how many weed seeds I'm preventing in the future and how much better I'm making my life going into the following year because I'm really preventing those weeds from becoming even more of a problem. So number one, removing weeds. Number two, cleaning up the dead plants. I mean, ultimately, you're removing debris, right? So after that first frost, you really want to get cleaning. You don't want this plant material to rot into the ground. So really, you want to get all of that up. Now, I will say this, if you didn't, think back to your garden. If you think about if you got photos of what was where, because if you did not, before you pull up all this garden debris, you very well may want to take notes, because trust me, if you're like me, next spring when it's time to get that, get those tomatoes in the ground or plant those squash, crop rotation can be really important with some plants. And if you don't remember what you put where last year, you're going to be upset at yourself. So now's the time. Take a couple notes in your little garden journal. Sometimes I have a really specific garden journal, and then for other things, I just have like a little cute little notepad with a little watering can on the front, and I just make little notes, just make a little mock map or whatever. But mostly I just take a zillion photos because I have a gardening podcast and I'm obsessed with the things that I grow. So I love to share them. Anyway, so take notes if you didn't get photos because you may not remember. Okay, so cleaning up these dead plants. Now listen, I am a fan of cutting off the plants at the soil level. I realize it takes more time. I realize that it's a lot more effort than it is to just yank those plants out of the ground, but I'm really getting into the no-till method, or at least not disturbing the soil as much as possible and leaving the root system in the soil. Is actually really good for it. And I'm hoping to have a no-till expert on the show over the next couple months so that if it's a method that we want to learn more about, and I know I do, then we can, just learn a lot more about that into next year. But again, I like to cut off the plants at the base and leave the roots in, but really take the plant matter off. So I would only consider doing that, however, if you know that your plant was disease-free. So if you had any powdery mildew or any blight, it's just best to, like I mentioned, just to get the roots out of that soil and dispose of those plants entirely. Now, a question I get a ton of is, do I throw away my plant matter or do I compost it? And Liz Hamilton answered this question perfectly on a previous podcast that she was on here on Gardening Utah. But essentially, you can compost a lot of your plant material, but if you were concerned about any sort of disease, especially squash bugs on your squash plants and cucurbits, I know I said that wrong. I swear it's the hardest word in the world to say, especially when you're talking solid for 12 and a half minutes. But so again, if you're not sure, then maybe err on the side of caution and throw away the plant material, the tomato plants or the squash plants. I know that I do have a lot of squash bugs in my yard. I manage them as best as I can, but I do have a lot. So I always throw away my squash plants and a lot of my tomatoes. Some of them I do. The smaller tips I find of the tomato plants, I find compost much better. Just because they're smaller. So I do usually cut those off, and they're less likely to have disease just because they're newer. So I usually cut those off and chuck those in the compost, but the rest I tend to throw away. Everyone kind of has their own different cadence, but as long as you're getting that plant material off of the garden bed or out of the raised bed, that is the most important thing. And you really want to rake out any rotting fruit as well. That's really important to clean up that material. Move it to maybe a part of your yard. Like I know some people like to leave it for the birds or any other little critters that they like to, be cool with in your yard. And you can put those somewhere else, but don't leave them sitting on the garden beds at all. Okay, so we've removed the weeds. We've removed the plant material. Now we're going to add in leaves, or compost or any other organic material. I was like a hound dog yesterday driving home from picking my daughter up from school, and I saw my neighbor raking bags and bags and bags of leaves. And I was just like, I just couldn't believe, like, I've got to get those leaves if she's going to throw them away. So I sent her a text. She actually did have them planned for someone else, unfortunately. But for me, it's like the more leaves, the better. In a past episode, you may have heard it, I did talk quite a bit on how to mulch those leaves. I like to get them down to dime size pieces, and I mow them over with the mower. And just over and over and over. But they're so easy to smash too. It kind of depends on how dry they are, but you really want to get those leaves, in many cases, just as small as possible, so that they don't kind of create like a moldy layer when we go through the freeze and thaw of the winter. But I love to get just a good layer of leaves and a good layer of compost right on top of that soil. I don't even till it in, because listen, the freeze and thaw of the winter will just really help work that material in. And then I like to add mulch as well. So, the most important thing is pull out and rake up the debris and cover it with a leaf mulch or any kind of mulch. So now that we're ready to get our gardens all winterized, we're going to come back after this next break, and we're going to talk about pumpkins. I'm going to give you some cool recipes. I'm going to give you a new way to think about pumpkins. Stay with us.
860 KKAT with Jana Francis and Gardening Utah, where it's always mulch time.
We are supported by ProgressivePlant.com, the perfect and unique plants that will thrive in your location. They are your neighbor's next door and experts at helping you choose the perfect and unique plants that will thrive in your location. Progressive Plants is passionate about helping homeowners, expert gardeners, novices alike choose the correct plant for your soil. They don't just grow plants, they know plants. Let Progressive Plants help you today. Just go to ProgressivePlant.com and check out their wide selection. You can also go to the Design tab and look at the expert designers that they have that can help you plan your perfect yard. Visit ProgressivePlants.com today.
She really does have the nicest yard on the block. It's Gardening Utah with Jana Francis on 860 KKAT.
Welcome back to Gardening Utah. I'm your host, Jana Francis. And if you're like me, you have a front porch loaded with pumpkins. And many of mine came from my garden. Some did, some didn't. Now, we didn't carve any pumpkins this year at my house because I really didn't have any big enough to, and my kids have kind of passed that stage. I just kind of have the teenager stage, so it wasn't like a tremendous amount of excitement to carve pumpkins, but I did do a really fun montage on my front porch of all the different pumpkins and created this cool sort of fall porch. And so I'm going to post that on the Gardening Utah Instagram page. So just look us up at Gardening Utah on Instagram. That's our handle. And you can have a look at what I did. Maybe it'll inspire you. But there are so many things you can do with your pumpkins. Now, whether they're the type that if you've already carved them, those really are the type of pumpkin that most generally are, they're really, they're coarse and they're stringy. The flesh really isn't good for making puree or anything of that nature, but they're great. In general, they're grown for feed for livestock, for farm animals. So once you've carved that pumpkin, if you don't have a compost pile, so first of all, number one, if you've carved the pumpkin, put it out in the compost, because after a couple weeks, it will make wonderful compost. It'll break down in just a couple weeks and give your gardens so many much needed nutrients. But if you don't have a compost pile, then see if if you've got a neighbor that has goats or pigs or chickens. I know almost everyone in my neighborhood has chickens, including myself. So I just give mine to my chickens. But I actually had my cousin bring over her carved pumpkins because I haven't really cut into many of mine yet. So my chickens were going crazy on the pumpkins that she had carved that she brought over today. So that was pretty cool. So the large pumpkins, you really don't want to be making like a pumpkin puree or a pumpkin soup or cooking with those. But again, if you haven't yet carved into them, you can totally eat the seeds. They're delicious. And you can also save the seeds to grow next year if you choose. So most often, if they're not like cross-pollinated, the pumpkins you can save that seed and grow pumpkins next year with it if you so choose. Another thing that I like to do with my pumpkins sometimes, if I didn't carve into them on Halloween, and that flesh is just too coarse and stringy, I will just chop it up and make an all-purpose like vegetable stock. So maybe I'll add onions, mushroom is delicious in stock, celery, parsley, anything else from the garden that you have that you just want to make a flavor out of. I mean, I just will chunk it up and just get the flavor out of it, and then discard it, add it to the compost, once you've made your stock. So that's another thing that I like to do with the large pumpkins that are just too stringy and coarse to make something out of. Now, pumpkins are one of my favorite things to cook with, especially this time of year. The smaller pie-type pumpkins are definitely the ones that you want to be cooking with, or the other like delicious winter squash like butternut or the delicata or anything else that you've grown or that you can find in the farmer's market right now. But pumpkin has so many uses, and the smaller ones, obviously you can still eat the seeds there, but you can also make delicious pumpkin puree. I mean, not only does the pumpkin itself store for so long, sometimes I have some going into January, February, if you leave it in a cool, dry place, like in your garage or a cellar, it will last quite some time, especially if it's cured and stored properly. But I love to, when it gets close to where I'm like, I probably should take care of this. If I am not making anything immediately, I will either chunk it up into, just regular diced size pizza pieces, and I'll set it out on a cookie tray and then freeze it individually so that once it's frozen, I will scoop up all those pieces into a bag, take as much of the air out as I can, and then they don't stick together and they last longer that way. And then whenever you're ready to make like a pumpkin soup, if you want to keep those chunks there, you can just add those right into your soup. Or you can I do this a lot, I will cut the pumpkin in half, scoop out the seeds, save the seeds, of course, and then add them cut side down onto a cookie tray with a little bit of olive oil, salt and pepper, and some water. Roast those in the oven until they are really soft, and then scrape out the flesh away from the skin and make a pumpkin puree. Put it right in the blender, blend it right up, and then freeze it if I'm not going to use it straight away. But I really love to make pumpkin soup. It's one of my very, very favorite dishes to make this time of year. So I make a lot of pumpkin soup and a lot of butternut squash soup. I have a different variety of squash that I grow called Curie, Kuri. Seeds available at bakercreekseeds.com. But I grow those and they make delicious soup as well. So anyway, I do a lot of those. And then a recipe that I want to share with you is my favorite pumpkin soup recipe, and I'm going to actually put a link to the recipe in the episode notes of Apple Podcast. So just go to episode 27 of Gardening Utah. In the episode notes, you will see a link to this recipe. It is a pumpkin soup with Gruyere cheese, and it's one of those where you cut off the top and you roast the pumpkin, and then you add the ingredients on the inside, kind of scoop out the flesh a little bit, and you add your Gruyere cheese, and let me tell you, it's incredible. And what's so fun about it is you're using the pumpkin as a soup bowl, and it just makes it that much more cool, and the kids really get a kick out of it. But the thing I love about pumpkin is you can make so many sweet dishes and so many savory dishes, and it's just so cool. And in the past, I know that, way back in the 1600s, I did a little research on this. It was interesting that they used to use the pumpkin as a cooking vessel. So they would cut off the top, scoop out the seeds, and they would add cream, spices, eggs, and honey. And they would put the top back on, and they would place the whole pumpkin on the coals to roast. And after a few hours, the top could be taken off, and they would scoop out the flesh inside and just eat everything from the inside out. That sounds pretty delicious. Not gonna lie, it would be kind of fun to do over a fire, so maybe I'll try it one of these days. Anyway, so there's so many different things you can do with pumpkins. One thing that really inspired me was this poem that I thought was so interesting, and this came from 1633. It said, "For pottage and puddings and custards and pies, our pumpkins and parsnips are common supplies. We have pumpkins at morning and pumpkins at noon. If we are not for pumpkins, we should be undoon." Whatever undoon means, that's pretty important. So I thought that was kind of an interesting A really interesting little poem there. Okay, so there's so many things to do in the garden, and horticulturist Liz Hamilton and Cameron Alcott from Progressive Plants are going to be with us in this next segment. Now, this is from episode 22 of Gardening Utah, where we answered a lot of our listener questions specifically around everything you should be doing right now to put your garden to bed that we have not yet discussed in today's episode. We go over some tips and tricks with composting, and we answer your questions. So stay with us. We'll be right back with Cameron and Liz right here on Gardening Utah.
She's more than just gardening puns and sage advice. It's Gardening Utah with Jana Francis on 860 KKAT. 860 KKAT. With more of the fastest growing show on radio. It's Gardening Utah with Jana Francis.
Welcome back to Gardening Utah. I'm your host, Jana Francis, with Cameron Alcott from Progressive Plants and horticulturist Liz Hamilton answering your fall gardening questions today. We are talking composting right now. That seems to be a big theme of questions in the group today. And Paulette is asking, she says, I just started a compost bin and I'm going to have tons of leaves to rake. Should I add them all or pile them somewhere in the yard where I can add them as I add kitchen scraps? I'm trying to get a balance of browns and greens. And then we also have a question from Jennifer that kind of segues that says, what should I add to my leaf mulch to help it break it down over the winter?
So what you want when you're starting at the compost pile is a ratio of 2-to-1 greens to browns. So 2 greens to every 1 brown. And if you have a ton of leaf mulch or leaves, which are considered browns, and not that much green, you're going to end up with the incorrect ratio to get your compost as hot as you need it, so that everything breaks down correctly. So what you can do, and I'll also say, not just, it's going to be easier on you if you don't just rake your leaves into a pile, you should shred them. So like rake them into a windrow and then run them over with the bagging mower if you have access to a bagging mower, and then take those and add that to your compost pile instead of just piling complete leaves on there. Shredded leaves are always better and they break down faster. And then collect your greens, and then if you have a pile of browns, add those back in as you add more greens to your compost pile. So have your designated compost pile, you're adding greens, and then add that. So for every 2 of greens, you add 1 scoop of browns or whatever, if that answers the question. And then for that, in terms of what can you add to your leaf mulch to help it break down over the winter, which was Jennifer Briggs' question, which is, what should I add to my leaf mulch to help it break down over the winter? And her question is, do I use blood meal? And so what you can use is any form of nitrogen, which blood meal is. Blood meal is an organic form of nitrogen, and that works. But typically what a lot of people will use is urea, so unpelleted nitrogen, which is usually like a 4600 if you buy that at the store. And nitrogen is super hot, and so you can fold that like immediate and see like an instantaneous heat. Like often you can see that smoking and steaming right away when you add urea. So blood meal is a good one, but it's going to be a slow burn and it's going to take a little bit to convert into nitrogen. Urea is going to be working on contact, and so that's another option. And it's just nitrogen. There's nothing else in it. And make sure you're buying unpelleted urea and not anything that's pelleted, because then it's going to take a while to break down, and unpelleted is going to be instant use on that. Gotcha. And then somebody else also asked, is it better to add compost now or in the spring? Oh, that's Kayleen Anderson Whitelock.
Yeah.
Is it better to add compost now or in the spring? And I assume she's asking about the garden.
Yeah.
And you should add compost anytime. If your compost isn't super broken down, if it's still kind of working on it, now is good, because then it can sit in that fall garden all winter long and break down even further. If it's broken down really well now, you can add it now or in the spring, either one. And then somebody else asked, what organic items can I till into my garden? Yeah. And is it better to till in the fall or the spring? So that was Brianna and Bailey asked those 2 questions in conjunction. And organic items that you can till into your garden are things like the blood meal that we just mentioned, bone meal is good. And then compost. Animal manure is good now because it takes the fall to break down and then it's ready to go by the time you get done in the spring or get ready to get going in the spring. And then Bailey asked, is it better to till in the fall or the spring? And it sort of depends on your garden. I would say if you're going to till, because you also hear about no-till, but if you're planning on tilling, I think once of each is best. So at the end of the season and then again in the spring. And I say that because tilling is good for controlling insects. And so if you had squash bugs, if you had aphids, if you had spider mites, turning that soil over and exposing it, if you have cutworms and armyworms that are nesting in the soil, things like that, turning that soil over, exposing that to sunlight, and then tilling that under and slowly destroying that population is what tilling is extra good for. And that's why they use it usually in commercial enterprises and stuff, because you're lowering your pest load when you're tilling. But again, that also applies to your beneficial insects as well. So you're tilling those under too. So something to think about. It's give and take there.
I've always wondered that. Well, because I listen to so many gardening podcasts, and a lot of them, especially ones in the UK, are talking so much about no-till, just add to your soil. And I've been really struggling with this lately.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some merit to both ideas. And, the science behind the studies in that, like, should I till my garden or should I not? You can have great results with both, but the science behind it kind of says it depends. It depends on when you're tilling and what you're tilling and why you're tilling. And tilling can be really good for some things, like if you're growing a carrot patch and you're starting with really compacted soil. If you have soil that's really rocky or really clayey, tilling in things that are going to help break that down and flocculate that soil or break those molecules down are going to be, better than just trying to layer stuff on the surface and hope that works. And so, there's mixed reviews out there, but the science says, yeah, it's great in some things and it's better to try and till in others. And for me, as somebody who ran 2 demonstration gardens that were side by side, I ran a conventional garden, edible garden, and a no-till all organic garden. And they were and of course you can't be certified organic because I was too close to the conventional garden, but they were managed differently. And so for me, I would say in the conventional garden, I had much lower pest loads. And I think that's because I tilled everything under and got rid of them. And got rid of much of them. And in the no-till garden, I had higher pest loads, but which was more difficult to deal with because it was an organic space. But it was cooler. It wasn't as hot. And so the plants seemed healthy, even though maybe they had some pest issues. And so, working in it was easier because I wasn't exhausted and hot all the time and things like that. So there were some benefits. I mean, you could walk from the conventional garden across, the 10-foot barrier that we had in between them and end up in that no-till, and it was significantly degrees cooler.
Wow.
I mean, just from going from one to the other, because the other one had more, I think, like residual humidity coming from the bark decomposing and the water retention that it had that I wasn't getting in the conventional side. So, I mean, either one is going to be, it sort of depends on your style and what's going to work for you and what works in your space and what your soil is. So there's not one really right answer there. But if you're going to till in the fall and then let it sit all exposed. So don't till it and then make it like rake it all down and make it look beautiful. Till it and leave it tilled up, and then rake it down, knock it down, till it and make it look beautiful in the springtime.
Aha. Oh, that's a fantastic tip. Okay. I got it.
Hey, so I got an answer to what hotboxing is.
Oh, you did? Here we go. Let's hear it.
So Susan writes, evidently people are putting tarps, their pulled beds, planting boxes, and the heat will kill the bugs in the soil like grubs and whatever. So I think she's kind of talking about like solarization.
Oh, solarization.
Yeah, which I know we normally do for like weeds and stuff like that. So that's what she means by hot boxing, not the giving it the old college try. Yeah. And I don't know how you feel about this, Liz, but I've never really been a big fan of like solarization, or I know that there's people are trying to be more organic, use like less chemicals, but it seems like a lot of these methods are actually more detrimental to soil health than just, isolating and doing like a spot treatment for something, if that kind of makes sense. Because when you generate that much heat, you kind of kill some of your bugs, but you're also killing all of the beneficial flora, all of the microorganisms that your plants will use in order to
heat is an organic indiscriminate killer.
Yes.
To put it that way.
Like Ted Bundy.
So okay, just like him. Heat is an indiscriminate killer, and so two thoughts on that. If you're solarizing now, no, it's not worth it, because we're headed into the cool season and you need hot temperatures in the summer to do that. And so, no, now it's not going to be worth it, and it's not going to be effective. And if you're talking about just in general, to maybe use next spring going into the summer, it's only effective in the top, I think in the studies they did, it's like 3 to 5 inches of soil. And so if you have deep-rooted perennial weeds like, the dreaded common bindweed, if you have white top, if you have Bermuda grass, quackgrass, those weeds are just going to laugh in the face of your solarization, and they will be right back, and you've done nothing to get rid of them. If your only issue is shallow-rooted annual weeds like chickweed and Veronica, speedwell, and things like that, and you're just trying to get rid of that heavy seed load, then it's effective, but and it would work. I think the things to consider is that it takes a while. It's not instantaneous. You got to leave it up for a month or two. And if you're trying to plant also in the spring, you're eating into your planting time. And by the time the solarization has gotten around to working, you're looking at midsummer, which is not an ideal time for planting. And it's not attractive to look at while you're doing it. And then it's also, kind of labor intensive to put down, I think, and then take back up. And again, like you mentioned, you're killing all of the good in the top 5 inches of soil as well as the bad. You're killing your seed load, but you've killed any worms, you've killed any microorganisms, you've killed any, fungal, abiotic, things like that. You've kind of gotten rid of all of those other issues as well, which might be what you want if you have things like, cutworms and stuff in your grass, but.
Yeah. Well, believe it or not, we only have 30 seconds left of this episode, and I can't even believe it's gone so fast. But we have a question from Barbara, and she asks, what to cut down to the ground? Mums, daylilies, ornamental grasses? That's a big question. We might need to answer some after the show, but give them the nuts and bolts, Cameron.
I would say go ahead and cut all of those things down after they have been frost damaged enough and are no longer actively growing. So probably November-ish.
Awesome. So if you're listening to this on the radio, you can download this episode on Apple Podcasts. It is episode 22 of Gardening Utah, and you will hear more of our conversation on that episode. Thank you so much for listening. Thanks for being here, you guys.
Thank you so much for having us.
Well, that's all for today's episode of Gardening Utah. Thank you so much to Liz and Cameron for joining me again. I'm telling you, Liz is such a genius. And look, she was also on episode 9 of Gardening Utah, so you can go on back and have a listen to her on that episode as well. And if you're listening to this on KKAT Radio, you can go to Gardening Utah on Apple Podcast and listen to more from Cameron and Liz just by searching episode 22. All right. Thank you so much for listening. Shout out to our producer, Lambo. I'm Jana Francis. See you next week here on Gardening Utah. And remember, grow big or go home.
When you're ready to grow big or go home, Make your neighbors green with envy. Get the Gardening in Utah podcast, Gardening Utah. Available wherever you get your podcasts and at 860kkat.com/garden.